All right, sit tight. Be right back. We're going to do 2 Corinthians chapter 12 with Rabbi Michael Skobac. We'll be right back. Sit tight. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of the Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Welcome back, sir. It's a pleasure to have you here. Figured I would drop the follow-up line I usually throw in there. Yeah, very good. So are you ready to tackle chapter 12, sir?
Boy, am I ever ready.
All right, so very good. So I didn't actually give it a title today. What would be today's title if you had one?
Oh, Paul's thorn.
Oh, this has been the million-dollar question throughout all humanity. What was the thorn in his flesh? Very cool. I think he just fell off his donkey and actually fell on a rose bush, to be honest with you. Just kidding. Anyway, so I guess we'll find out. At least we'll get some pretty good ideas.
That would be one long-acting thorn, if that was the case.
Yeah. Indeed. Okay, very good. I'll pass it on to you. Thank you, Rabbi.
So, first of all, it's interesting being here at this new time slot.
Yes, thank you for complying, by the way.
And we'll see how it works out. Hopefully it's good for everyone. And we're basically rounding the corner to the completion of 2 Corinthians, because next time we meet, the last chapter is sort of not much going on. So in this chapter, Paul basically, he's dealing, as we've said before, one of the themes in this book is Paul having to deal with some serious challenges to his legitimacy and his credibility. And basically, it seems that the Corinthians, as he painted them in 1 Corinthians, they were very impressed. They were fascinated by supernatural occurrences, by mystical experiences, by visions. And so it seems that, Paul feels that his opponents, the people that are leading the charge against his credibility, have possibly been claiming that they themselves, that they had mystical visions and spiritual experiences and supernatural occurrences in their lives. So it seems that Paul might feel challenged by this, and he has a need now to prove himself by showing that he's no less than these other teachers that have been coming to the Corinthian church. And so in order to prove his legitimacy to the Corinthians, Paul says here that he is now forced to break a 14-year silence that he had about some kind of a supernatural experience that he had previously. And that's how this chapter begins. He says, I must go on boasting. So in the previous chapter also, he basically was dealing with this idea that he has to boast and toot his own horn. Although it's strange, he says there's nothing to be gained by it. So he, on the one hand, says that I'm forced to boast now. And immediately he says, but I'm not sure what will come of it. And he says, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. So he basically, this is the the sort of the preview of the chapter, is that he's going to be speaking about some kind of visitation or revelation that he had. And he goes on in verse 2, and this is sort of an interesting way of presenting it. He says, I know a man in the Messiah who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. Only God knows. So he basically goes on to say that in verse 3, and I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. It seems that verse 3 is actually very much repetitious. He basically has already said this in verse 2, that, this person, whoever he is, was taken up to the third heaven. whether this person had an out-of-the-body experience or in-the-body experience. Paul says, I don't really know, only God knows. Now, virtually all the commentaries to the book of Corinthians say that Paul is speaking about himself, although he expresses this as, someone else. He says, I know somebody who knows somebody. So David Stern in his commentary says that he spoke here obliquely about himself, meaning he didn't want to say this happened to me. He says, I know someone this happened to. And he says he did this out of modesty. That's why Paul didn't speak directly about himself. The problem is that if it is so obvious to everyone that he really is speaking about himself, then it's sort of not a very genuine kind of modesty and humility. Because I don't think there's anyone reading this chapter who really thinks that Paul is speaking about anyone other than himself. So it's not clear what he gains by not just coming straight out and saying that this vision was something that happened to him, or this experience of being caught up into the third heaven is something that happened to him. This phrase, by the way, this is an aside, of being caught up is something that Paul will come back to in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17. That's the famous passage that some Christians use to support the idea of a rapture, that when Jesus comes and the believers will be raptured up into the air, they'll be caught up into the air. And, I remember there's a time, and I'm not sure they do it anymore, because I think most of the Christian bookstores around here have closed, thanks to the internet. But I remember going to Christian bookstores and seeing these rapture posters where you'd see these planes flying, and then, one pilot would go missing, and then the plane would crash into a mountain, or you'd see, cars going off the interstate because the drivers were raptured. Sort of somewhat funny and macabre posters of what this is going to look like when, people are raptured up into the air. So it's the same kind of expression here that Paul speaks about being caught up into the third heaven. Although he says that it's not clear whether this was in a bodily experience or an out-of-body experience. And I just find that very hard to believe, meaning that if he's talking about something that he himself experienced, which it seems that that's what's going on in this chapter, it's hard to imagine that he couldn't tell the difference between a vision that he was having and an actual physical experience. Sometimes when you're having a dream, it is hard to know whether or not you're actually dreaming or it's actually happening. But usually when a person has a supernatural experience, I would imagine that, they have some way of knowing what they're experiencing. So David Stern, in his commentary, tries to compare this experience to the famous story in the Talmud in Tractate Chagiga 14a of the four great sages, shenichnesu lepardes, that they entered into the orchard. And, it's very clear that in that story, the four sages did not actually go to a physical place. These were four sages that were basically studying and meditating and contemplating, and they clearly had mystical experiences. They weren't actually traveling anywhere physically. But Paul seems to be saying, at least according to one understanding here, that he was actually physically taken up into the heavens. And he writes that he heard things there that cannot be told, which I can't even speak about. So it is sort of strange that he claims to have had this incredible experience, but he really can't tell much about it. And again, if the whole purpose of this relaying this experience is to, impress people with the kind of experiences that he had, that, look at what happened to me. So it is sort of a tease to tell people half a story that, this happened to me. And, if anyone presses him for details, he can't really explain anything more than this sort of very vague general description of the experience. And that's how the chapter gets started, that Paul is forced into, I guess, to validate his own legitimacy as a teacher and as a person of substance by telling about this incredible experience he had. I mean, I wonder why Paul chose to focus on this experience from 14 years prior, because Paul is constantly claiming that Jesus speaks to him. And so he could have basically spoken about that as well. So maybe in his mind, this was the most dramatic experience he had. Very hard to say. So moving on in the chapter, Paul goes on to say in verse 5 that on behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast. Now that seems to be a verse which clearly distinguishes between himself and this alleged person. But somehow, all the commentaries insist no, that really this person that he's speaking about is really Paul. And he says that I'm not going to boast about anything except, he says, for my weaknesses. And he goes on to explain, this is the famous verse that you mentioned before, that he says to keep me, in verse 7, he says to keep me from becoming a conceited person, to keep me from becoming arrogant and conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. Now, isn't this cute? So here, Paul is bursting his own bubble, meaning here he's sort of telling you that the story about this experience of going up to the third heaven, he's saying it was about me, about myself. And that's why he says a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. So the entire presentation of this mystical experience, and sort of pinning it on someone else, it has a ring of absurdity to it, because the jig is up when a few verses into the story, he just tells everyone that obviously it's me. So I just find the presentation strange, meaning that A, he doesn't really accomplish any kind of humility because it's so obvious he's speaking about himself, and B, he sort of spills the beans in the middle of the story by saying that the person that had these incredible supernatural visions was me. And he says that's why I had to be given this thorn in the flesh, which he refers to as a messenger of Satan, to harass me, to basically keep me from becoming conceited. Now, the expression, this phrase of a thorn in the flesh, it actually comes up in the Tanakh, or some form of it, about 3 or 4 times. The first time is in Numbers chapter 33, verse 55, where it's speaking about when the Jewish people will enter the land of Israel. They need to drive out the inhabitants of the land. Right? When they go into the land, they have to drive out the inhabitants. And so God says to them in this verse that if you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land, they will be thorns in your sides. That's actually the first place in the Tanakh that this expression comes up, of a thorn in the side, a thorn in the flesh, meaning that it's a description of an opponent, of people that will oppose you. You have something similar in Joshua chapter 23, verse 13, where it speaks about not thorns in the flesh or thorns in the side, but thorns in your eyes. That's obviously even worse. It's one thing to get stuck by one of those rose bushes in your side, but to have the thorn go into your eyeball, that's not fun. And then you have in Judges chapter 2, verse 3, it's implied that it's speaking about thorns in your sides. And then finally in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 24, it speaks about having a painful thorn, a painful thorn. So there's been a huge amount of speculation over the years, over the centuries, about what this thorn in Paul's side may have been, or in his flesh, what the thorn in his flesh may have been. And I did a little bit of poking around, a little bit of research, and I have to confess that after coming up with 21 possibilities, I basically called it quits. I think there are probably many more that have been offered. So I'm just going to share what I found in terms of what people think this thorn in Paul's flesh was. So some people think that it wasn't physical. Some people think that it was a spiritual or psychological anxiety that, like anguish, for example, that he was feeling over the fact that his brethren in the flesh, what he refers to as the Israelites, the Jewish people, were not embracing Jesus, and therefore they were facing an eternity in hell. And so this was something that was bringing Paul down. It was depressing, and it was a psychological or spiritual anxiety that really was handicapping him. Or some people think that the anxiety might have been incredible regret over his prior persecution of the Jesus movement, meaning that I'm not personally convinced that he did all this persecuting, but at least in his own autobiography, Paul basically claims that he viciously persecuted the followers of Jesus, throwing them in prison, and some of them he helped even kill some of them. And so he's feeling tremendous regret and remorse over those experiences, and maybe that was this thorn in his flesh that just wouldn't go away. It was constantly gnawing at him, constantly irritating him. So that's the first suggestion, that this thorn in the flesh is a spiritual or psychological anxiety that was plaguing him. A second approach to this question of what is the thorn in Paul's flesh is that he's referring to the opposition to his ministry. I mean, this entire book, he's dealing with these, what he calls false teachers, super apostles. He's got a lot of names for the people that were coming to oppose him. And these he sees as a thorn in his flesh, meaning that they are certainly, making his life difficult. And again, helping him not to grow arrogant. So that's the second approach that's basically given to what the thorn in Paul's flesh was. It was the people that were opposing him in his ministry. Number three, many people think, because it's described as a thorn in the flesh, is that it was some kind of recurring, tormenting physical malady. And I'll share some of what these might have been. Some people suggest that this thorn in his flesh may have been very strong and disturbing sexual urges, that he may have been struggling with these. Especially, you can imagine someone that never married. This may have been, a difficulty for him, and it may have been a thorn in his flesh. That was really, something that was very difficult to deal with, and also prevented him from becoming too arrogant. In terms of what some of the physical ailments might have been, there are a lot of different possibilities offered. Some say it was some kind of venereal disease. Some people think that it might have been some kind of a problem with his eyes, problem with his vision. Some people think that it may have been severe headaches, like migraine headaches. Some people think that it may have been some kind of a malaria fever. Some people think it may have been some kind of a handicap, like stuttering or another kind of speech impediment. Some people think that it may have been an earache, a very painful earache, or a recurrent fever that wouldn't go away, or some chronic illness. There are plenty of chronic illnesses people can get, or a depression, meaning that he became clinically depressed. Some people think that it might have been demonic harassment, meaning that he had a demon that was constantly harassing him. Some people think that it may have been another kind of temptation, not necessarily sexual, but a recurring temptation such as greed. And, we see in this book of 2 Corinthians that he's sometimes accused of being greedy and trying to manipulate people for their money. So it could be that this is something that he actually struggled with, to have the temptation such as greed. Some commentaries say that this is a spin of John MacArthur and others, that it was a demon that basically indwelled into the leader of the false apostles, meaning that we know that there were what he refers to as false teachers and false apostles, but there may have been a leader, one particular person that was the rabble rouser against Paul. And so John MacArthur says that the thorn in Paul's flesh, which he describes as a messenger of Satan, may have been the fact that a demon was dwelling in the leader of the opposition against him. That actually is a view that's held by a number of different commentaries. Some people think that the thorn in his flesh may have been a physical deformity, which may have, been something which made it, hard for him to maintain a full sense of dignity. People may have mocked him for it, and so that might have been something that kept him humble. Some people think that the demon in his flesh may have been a temptation to heresy or a temptation to unbelief, meaning that Paul comes across as someone that's a very, very profound believer in Jesus. And, if anything, people have a lot of complaints about Paul, but certainly he's someone that's sold, out totally in terms of his faith. He seems to really deeply believe. But it could be that he's constantly trying to emphasize how much he believes, because it may have been a weak spot, and he may have to overcompensate by speaking a lot about his faith and by maybe putting on a good front. So some people think this may have been the thorn in his flesh, a temptation to unbelief. And other people think, this I think is the last one that I'm going to share, is that it may have been an infirmity of temperament, meaning that he may have had a horrible temper. And, that is something which will work against someone, if they want to be a leader. That certainly is not going to stand in their good stead to have a horrible temper. Now, what's interesting, just as an aside, is that in the Zondervan Study Bible, they have a comment which, they express surprise. And they say that as well as being a gift from God, the thorn is surprisingly called a messenger of Satan. The Zondervan Study Bible, seems to feel that this is very incongruous, meaning that if something is a gift from God, how could it possibly at the same time be a messenger from Satan? They seem to believe that, these are mutually exclusive. They seem to believe that, there's nothing, no common ground between God and Satan. And that's coming from, obviously, a very Christian dualistic view of Satan, which sees Satan as essentially the leader of an opposing team against God. And the biblical view of Satan is that Satan's on God's team. It's just that Satan has assignments to tempt people, but he's doing that for their ultimate benefit, meaning that I think many Christians don't see any upside to satanic temptation. And from a Jewish biblical point of view, there's a very, very important reason to have that. Meaning, if a person goes through life and there are no obstacles and no temptations and no, nothing that gets in the way of their spiritual progress, they're never going to make any spiritual progress. Meaning that in order to grow, we need to overcome resistance. And so if our lives had no resistance, if there was nothing opposing our spiritual walk and our spiritual growth, then there'd be no chance to have any virtue. There'd be no chance to grow because there'd be no resistance to overcome. So actually, biblically speaking, it shouldn't be surprising that a messenger of Satan is at the same time a gift from God, because anything that God does is for our benefit. And if God sends a satanic being, an angel, to tempt us or to make our spiritual path more difficult, it's for our benefit, because it's through overcoming that obstacle that we grow and we earn a tremendous amount of merit. Meaning, again, a life that has no temptation and no obstacles, no one's going to cheer for you at the end of the day. But if a person manages to face temptations in life and challenges in life and succeeds in overcoming them, that's something that's worthy of taking notice, and God certainly takes notice. So, the Zondervan Study Bible, I think, gives away a bit of their perspective, which is, again, it's a Christian perspective on Satan, and, it's just expressing that it's, from their point of view, impossible to see Satan as an upstanding member of God's team. But in fact, that's exactly what Satan and any kind of satanic experience is. It's a player on God's team that was given a role by God to tempt people and to obstruct their spiritual path in order to give an opportunity for the people to grow and to earn merit. Now, one of the verses in this chapter that I found difficult was I believe it's verse 8 here, where Paul says that 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. I mean, apparently this thorn in his flesh was so difficult to deal with, and it was so disturbing, that Paul pleaded with the Lord about it 3 times, that it should leave, to take it away. The question is, who is the Lord here? And many Christian commentaries assume that it's talking about Jesus, in which case, we've been dealing with this question since the beginning of our studies of Paul. What was his belief about Jesus? Did he see Jesus as a divine being worthy of worship? And so this would be, I think in 95% of the material that we've seen, it seems pretty clear that Paul did not believe that Jesus was God. Here, if it's talking about Jesus, then it seems that Paul is praying to Jesus, and this would be one of these verses you can stick on the other side of the ledger, because it may be an indication that Paul believed that Jesus was more than just a human being. Is it possible that when he uses the phrase the Lord, he could be referring to the Almighty, to God the Father? I don't see why not, logically speaking. It's just that I don't think that Paul normally refers to the Father as the Lord. I think that his default position has been to speak about Jesus in that way. So I have to basically take this verse and put a big question mark over it, because it seems to go against the trend of everything else we've seen, basically. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Then in verse 11, Paul says, I have been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you. For I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. Now, it's not the clearest kind of prose that you read. The question is, who is Paul speaking about in this passage? When he speaks about, I'm not at all inferior to these super apostles. So the simplest way of understanding it is that he's going back to the super apostles of the previous chapters, which were the quote-unquote false teachers, the so-called false teachers that were harassing him in Corinth. And Paul says, look, I'm not inferior to them. On the other hand, some of the Christian commentaries say that the super apostles he's referring to here could be the apostles in Jerusalem, meaning they could be referring to the disciples of Jesus in the Jerusalem church, such as Peter and John and James, because he sometimes refers to them as super apostles. And here, he was certainly inferior to them, meaning even though he didn't feel inferior, in many ways, Paul seems to feel he was even superior to the original apostles, because he seems to have basically felt that those people only knew the terrestrial, earthly Jesus. And Paul says, look, I'm someone who's very intimate with the risen, spiritual Jesus, so Paul may actually have even felt superior to the original disciples. But it seems to me that, that's the height of arrogance. I think I've mentioned before that when Paul has his experience on the road to Damascus, he later brags. He says, almost bragging, and I didn't go to, the apostles in Jerusalem to consult with, James and Peter and John. And I wonder why not. He never met Jesus. He doesn't know anything about Jesus. He believes that Jesus came and spoke to him. But, any normal human being would have said, I better hightail it to Jerusalem because I need to find out about who Jesus was and what he taught and what he was all about and what was his mission and what was the history, what was going on. And I know who the people were. I know the people that were right there with him. So he was someone who didn't have any exposure. He never met Jesus in his lifetime, actual physical flesh and bones Jesus. And for that reason alone, you could say Paul was inferior to the original disciples, original apostles. And one of the things, again, that's constantly hounding Paul is how true he was to the teachings of Jesus, meaning Jesus, we saw, constantly spoke about the importance of Torah observance, and he stresses it. It's that's what's going to make someone the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and people who are not Torah observant will be least in the kingdom of heaven. And he says to the young ruler, if you want to have eternal life, keep the commandments. And so, you see that very clearly coming out of the mouth of what Jesus allegedly says. And yet, this is not what Paul teaches. Paul seems to be teaching that, no, everything depends only on how much faith you have in Jesus. And so, I think that Paul was always under a cloud of suspicion. How authentic is he when his teachings seem to be so divergent, so different than what Jesus taught? And again, we saw in the book of Acts, there were all these rumors that were flying around that Paul was teaching not just the Gentiles, that Paul was teaching even the Jews living in the diaspora. They didn't need to circumcise their children. They didn't need to observe the laws. They didn't need to follow the Torah. So, when Paul basically asserts here that I'm not at all inferior to the super apostles, well, so again, if he's referring to the super apostles in Jerusalem, I would beg to differ. If he's just making the claim, the boast that he's just as good, if not better, than what he refers to as false teachers coming to Corinth, then, it's his word against theirs. Now, I have just one more observation on this chapter. It's not a very long chapter for us. And that is that, again, we've been reading this book specifically, and we've seen how often it just seems that the style of what we're reading sounds like a personal letter that Paul is writing, and it does not sound like something that was divinely revealed. There's no indication that these words are coming from God. It seems all the evidence seems to just indicate that this is something that Paul is writing. And what I ended up doing because I think that something made me curious, is I started to count up in this chapter every single time that Paul uses the words I, me, or my. And wouldn't you know that even though this chapter only has 21 verses, it's only 21 verses long, he uses these words, I, me, or my, at least 63 times. That's mind-blowing. there's a cute story that's told. I've heard many versions of it, but I'll just give the basic version, where there was someone who sent a letter to his rabbi because he was having difficulties at home with his relationship with his wife. And he wrote this very long letter to his rabbi asking for, suggestions and advice. And the rabbi took a red pen, and he noticed that every single sentence that this person wrote began with the word I. And then the word I appeared, and my and me and my many times in the letter. So the rabbi just circled in red every time that he used the word I and me or my. And he didn't write anything other than that. He just circled these words, and he mailed the letter back to his student. Presumably, the student got the point. And so, when we read a chapter like this, and, about 3 times in every single verse, Paul is saying I and me and my, it just, to me, bolsters the impression, at least, that this chapter leaves me with, that this is nothing going on here of divine revelation. This is basically a person that's under a certain amount of stress because his credibility is being challenged, and he's feeling the pressure of people that are challenging his position as the leader of the Corinthian church, and people that are teaching things that he believes are not true. And so he has to launch into a very aggressive and strong defense of himself. And that's why he's so focused on me, myself, and I over and over and over again. So it just seems to me that, with everything else that we've seen, that this as well, this chapter shows that we're reading basically a personal letter that Paul has written. And, you're not going to find God behind the curtain here. This is not divine revelation. And that's more or less all I really had to reflect on in this chapter. Right. Again, I'm sure that if we did more research, we would find more than 21 possibilities for what Paul's thorn was. But I guess it's a mystery that the church will always struggle with, because Paul never told us, didn't tell anyone what this was.
Right. Wow. Maybe it was a possibility that was just a sense of false humility that he was, and not joking. I mean, seriously, it might be something that he was saying. You don't accuse me of being prideful, because there's no possible way I could be prideful. God's making me stay humble because He gave me this tic tac behind my ear. You know what I mean? So, and it's a possibility. So.
One thing that I always wondered, Paul did not live on some deserted island and write these letters, and then, people in the church got them decades later. Paul was a teacher. Paul had students. He probably had disciples, and he probably had proteges. And what to me is puzzling is, Paul may not have spelled out in 2 Corinthians here what this thorn was, but you would imagine that people who were close to him must have known. Mm-hmm. It's hard to believe that he never shared it with a close friend or a close disciple. And, what you would have expected, in the same way, there's always, I remember there was a scene, I forget the name of the movie. It was the famous film where they have the trial of the 2 Marines, and this, I think I might have seen this a million years ago, but there's a very interesting scene where one of the attorneys is questioning someone, and I think he hands them a book of the Marine regulations. What is it that the Marines are required to do, and what are their the guide rules and their policies. And he asked them a very simple question. I forget what it was, like something like, where do people, do you have breakfast in the morning? Yeah. And where do you go for breakfast? He said, well, in the mess hall. And he said, well, where does it say that in the book here? Where does it say in the book that you eat in the mess hall? And the guy looked at him like he was crazy because, you don't have to say that in a book. Everyone knows it because that's what people do every day.
Right.
And so any culture has, their written documents, but they have an oral tradition. They have, stuff that just people know because it's out there. And so, Paul, we know, was a historical character. We know Paul actually, there are people who question whether Jesus existed. Paul, we know, was a historical figure. And, it's just very, very difficult to imagine that he never discussed this irritant with anyone, and that over the course of history, there never emerged an oral tradition, right? Like, what did Paul's students say to people about their master's, thorn? So I find that puzzling, that, there was never anything that sort of got passed down in church history, with the sort of the inside scoop on what was Paul's. So everyone basically just speculates. Everyone comes up with their own theories, and that's why there are so many.
Right. Very true. Well, it definitely leaves a lot to speculation for sure. And interestingly enough, regarding the whole thing about Jesus, whether he existed or not, the only thing that I've seen so far or heard is that there is a Jesus mentioned in the Talmud somewhere. But then again, Jesus was just as a popular name as Mary would be, in the sense of the usage of their Hebrew names anyway. So that's really not really saying much. But then we have the thing with Paul, there seems to be enough historic evidence that he existed, but really there isn't really anything written outside the Bible about Jesus. So, I mean, it's like maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know. I think he did. I mean, my gut is saying he did, but then again, my gut thought the Holy Spirit was only through him too. So,
well, I mean, I personally, I don't question whether there was a historical character named Jesus. I believe there was such a person, but it's curious that someone, like that didn't leave more of a footprint behind.
Right, right.
And you have passages in the Talmud that, again, as you mentioned, the name Yeshu or Yeshua, Jesus obviously is not in the Talmud, but those other forms are popular names, so it didn't have to apply to him. And the stories in the Talmud seem to be speaking about someone who lived about 160 years prior to Jesus of Nazareth.
Gotcha.
So the Talmud is not, it's not a terrible source. I mean, some people will go to the bank with it, but I don't think it's a very strong source because there's no slam dunk that it's speaking about the Jesus of Christianity. Josephus would have been the place you would have thought it would appear, because Josephus was, more or less contemporary, lived a little bit afterwards, and, he wrote a very, very detailed history of that time. Tons of things that took place at that time, and, basically no mention of Jesus. Now, we do find in, some manuscripts of Josephus, pretty wild claims about him,
right,
the kind of language that you would never expect from a religious Jew. And we know that Josephus was a religious Jew. He even wrote a book defending Judaism against pagans. He wrote a book called Keneged Apion, against Apion, where he is a religious, traditional, normal Jew. And so if you read the manuscripts of Josephus, where he allegedly writes about Jesus, no Jew that's a believing Jew would write those things. And so the fact is that, these are manuscripts of Josephus that were not known early on. They're not known by the early church fathers don't know about it. They only begin appearing later on in history. And so it seems that the consensus among scholars is that these passages where Josephus speaks about Jesus were interpolations meaning they were forgery by Christian monks later on in history. There may have been some very oblique reference to Jesus, but certainly not the kind of passage that we see in his writings. And then there's almost nothing else. There's one very brief line in Tacitus, the Roman historian, but basically nothing. And so, you would expect much more, especially when you read the Gospels.
Yeah, with all the miracles and
all the miracles,
even the death of the babies that they claim to plagiarize from the Moses story. I mean, even something like that would certainly be in the writing somewhere in historical documentation. So.
And the graves in Jerusalem opening up, and the righteous people coming out of their graves and appearing to many people. I mean, there's some amazing stories that it's hard to believe they didn't get past the editor.
Right. True.
So, Paul, there's no question about whether Paul existed. And so, who did Paul, unless Paul never spoke to anyone, unless Paul was such a loner, but it's hard to believe that. So I just find this question curious, why there was never any kind of just a simple oral tradition about what was really bothering Paul.
Right. Very true.
Okay, Habibi.
All right. Sweet Rabbi, thank you, man. It was a great show for sure. Appreciate your time. And thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and turn on the notifications. That way you can get alerted. Some people are saying they haven't been getting notified. So somebody tested it.
No.
They turned the notifications off and then returned it back on again, and it seemed to fix the problem. I do know that YouTube has been acting really, really quirky today for sure. It's been giving me loading up errors and all kinds of stuff. So if you're watching this, if you're trying to watch this on YouTube and it seems to not be as long as the actual video, it's because it's just going through problems. So I will probably monitor this video overnight and see if it uploads a clean version. If it doesn't, then I'll upload one from my hard drive directly to, so I can have a full copy there. So, but Facebook, I don't think they had any problems with Facebook. So, all right. So, Rabbi, thank you so much again for your time, and thank you all once again for tuning in. Shalom, shalom, Shavuot Tov. And Rabbi, are we on next week? Next Sunday is Shavuos, I believe. So,
correct.
We will be off next week. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, so we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Thank you all once again, and thank you, Rabbi. Take care. Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye.
Shalom, shalom. חשוב מכל חשוב